Good evening and a very warm welcome to today's seminar. How can partnership with families run through family support and child protection systems and practice? I'm Angela Fraser-Wicks and I will be your co-chair for today. I'm a birth parent, having lost my eldest two children to adoption back in 2004, predominantly due to domestic violence. I'm also a mum to a 10-year-old daughter who's had no local authority involvement whatsoever. And shortly before Christmas last year, I was reunited with my eldest son, who's now an adult. I first became involved with Family Rights Group back in 2008, when they invited me to co-chair an international conference after hearing me speak about my own experiences at an event on adoption. FRG understood way back then the importance of working with people with lived experience. 5 years later, in 2013, I was proud to be a founding member of their parents panel, one of their expert panels made up of people with lived experience of the child welfare and family justice system. We brought together birth parents, adopters, parents who were once in care themselves, and kinship carers. Over the years, they have informed all the work of Family Rights Group, spoken at international events, and become an intrinsic part of FRG. So much so that 50% of the Board of Trustees is now made up of people with lived experience. So I sit here today, 13 years on from that first conference, co-chairing another FRG event. But today, I am honoured to do so as their newly appointed chair of the Board of Trustees. Family Rights Group have demonstrated the importance of partnership working, leading by example, and I feel setting the bar for others to follow. They understand that whilst we may not want the perspective we have, it's a unique and valuable insight that can help shape policy and practice. Our experiences can help to educate and inform. And most of all, we have a right to be seen and heard, not just within the context of proceedings, but by the wider system as a whole. Over the years, I've seen a much needed shift in the way families are viewed and seen them begin to be valued, and rightly so. As well as my role with FRG, I'm currently co-chair of CAFCAS Learning and Improvement Board, looking at improving the way they work with families where there has been domestic abuse. I also sit on the advisory board for their newly formed Family Forum. I'm on the Expert by Experience board of the current independent review into children's social care. I work with BASWA on the 80-20 campaign, looking at improving relationship-based practice. I sit on the advisory board for the Born into Care study at Lancaster University, and I deliver training to practitioners across the country. Whilst there's still an enormous way to go and huge changes are still needed, the progress I've seen genuinely gives me hope for the future. One where families are involved, not just because someone says they must be, but because all those involved in the child welfare and family justice system finally understand why we should be. Before I hand over to my co-chair for her to introduce herself and begin today's event, I'd like to remind you all of you joining today, both on Zoom and the live stream on YouTube, that you can post comments and questions in the chat. Whilst we'll be monitoring the chat and feeding comments and questions back to the panel, I apologise that we won't be able to respond to everyone individually. Please do feel free to introduce yourselves to one another though. Should anyone wish to tweet about the event, please do so. And could you use the hashtag #FamiliesAsPartners? I'll ensure that we keep posting it in the chat as a reminder for everyone. And that's enough from me. Now all that remains is for me to hand over to Justice Knowles. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Gwyneth Knowles. I'm a High Court judge in the Family Division. And as a High Court judge sitting there, I've got some additional responsibilities. Two important aspects of my additional responsibilities are, first of all, that I'm the lead judge for domestic abuse in England and Wales. And secondly, the lead judge for family drug and alcohol courts. The other responsibility that I have is that I'm a member of the design group of the Review of Children's Social Care. And one other perhaps more interesting fact about me is that before I became a lawyer over 25 years ago, I spent 6 or 7 years working as a social worker with children and families with mental health problems. I want to say really two important things. First of all, to set the context for the challenges in particular to the family justice system. And secondly, to talk about the objectives of the Public Law Working Group and their key areas of focus that reflect upon what we're going to be considering this evening, which is partnership with families. The family justice system is really just one part of the safeguarding landscape for children. For children in care proceedings, it's of course the end point, often when all other options have been exhausted. I want to highlight a couple of things about the challenge that the family justice system faces at the moment. Just as with the increasing numbers of children in the social care system at all levels, there have certainly until the beginning of the COVID pandemic in March 2020 been rising numbers of children involved in public law proceedings, though the COVID pandemic has seen a levelling off in that increase. Many of those children are young babies, but very significantly, many of these children involved in care proceedings are older children whose needs are especially complex and difficult to resolve. The Review of Children's Social Care Case for Change document published in the early summer of this year noted really that our current child protection system really fails teenagers facing harm outside the family home. And the family justice system probably doesn't deal with it very well either. It finds enormous difficulties trying to resource appropriate placements for young people and take decisions which will promote their welfare in circumstances where their needs are so complex and the resources that might meet those needs are often sadly lacking. The second thing I'd want to highlight about the family justice system at the moment is that it comes as no surprise that, magnified by the COVID pandemic, there are enormous delays in resolving proceedings. The difficulties in social work availability, in people being able to advise the court, and indeed in the number of judges to decide cases when they're live. The third thing is that, of course, the outcomes of public law proceedings can result in the separation of children and young people from all they know, weakening important relationships with lifelong impacts. So that, I suppose one way of putting it is that children are unanchored to their family and to their community, placing them at significant disadvantage. One of the things that the family justice system has tried to do, I think better than it used to, is to make the best use of a family's own resources, such as the availability of kinship carers. I'd like to move on to think about what the Public Law Working Group, which published its report last year, said that might be of relevance to our discussion this evening. At the risk of oversimplification, it came out with two messages. First of all, better support for and work with families prior to the start of proceedings. And secondly, better management of cases once they're in proceedings. I'm going to think about the first of these. The report was absolutely clear that the child should be at the centre and that there should be better communication with and legal advice for parents faced with care proceedings and with local authority involvement, and much better resources devoted to identifying, using and assessing friends and family support. The best guidance published by the review emphasised working in partnership with parents in a collaborative approach so that would support positive change that was in the best interests of the children. The key question of tonight's event is how can partnership with families run through both family support and child protection systems and practice, as well as within the family justice system. I want to, first of all, introduce you to members of the family rights groups, parents and kinship carers panels, and hear them talk about their experience of the system, the challenges they've encountered, and what they think needs to change.
Hello, my name is Catherine. I became involved with Children's Services because we were asked as a family to put ourselves forward to care for my great niece long term.
Hi, my name is Hussein, and I became involved with the Children's Services several years ago when I reached out for help to protect my very young child from witnessing the domestic violence that I was being subjected to by my then partner.
My name's Martin. I became a kinship carer in late 2011 until little shy of 2020 for my niece and nephew, aged 5 and 7.
Hello, my name is Tori. I became involved with Children's Social Services because I couldn't cope with my daughter's grief and erratic behaviour that was stemming from the anxiety that she was suffering with. And sadly, I began to self-harm and disclosed to the school who wanted early help. But I escalated it to Children's Social Services to say that I was terrified I couldn't keep my child safe from her own behaviour.
I feel I was really well informed and supported throughout my journey to become a special guardian.
Social services, rather than supporting me, they targeted me. Evidence was presented to them that they didn't even care to note down in their record files. They supported the perpetrator and re-victimized the victims.
There was struggles, as it was grossly underfunded, no real support in process or policies in comparison to other types of care.
Although I had sought help and understanding, sadly it became investigative, intrusive, and the stigma around being involved with children's services was shameful. And it was just a really awful experience on top of everything else that we'd had to deal with.
In my opinion, the most important changes that could be made to the child welfare system so that it works for families would be to support every single kinship family properly. This support should start from the first contact until the child is 18 years old.
Not to judge a book by its cover, and to also work on supporting families rather than targeting families. There are male victims out there. Abuse can be perpetrated by anyone against anyone, regardless of the shape, the size, the color, the ethnicity, or how a person presents themselves.
Not to judge, to actually support where people are asking for help, and to look at the family dynamic to see where the child will be most happy, safe, and had that structured family environment to then help the parent or the carer to get back on their feet and access the help and support that they need to become well.
With those thoughts and observations ringing in our ears, I'd like, first of all, to introduce Teresa Levy, who is the Executive Director for Children in Dorset Council, who's going to be our first speaker. Teresa.
Good evening, colleagues, and thank you so much for this invitation. I'm just having a few minor technical problems, so I'm hoping this is going to hold up. We've been having a busy afternoon here in Dorset celebrating Social Worker of the Year, and I'm sitting here on the bay in Weymouth looking out to sea. So if any of you want a breath of fresh air, a breath of that sea air, I'll happily sort of send it down the line to you all. It is genuinely a pleasure to be able to talk with you tonight and to think together about how we stay completely focused on that requirement to keep families at the heart of everything we do. And when we do that together, Angela Fraser-Wicks, your introduction was so palpable to me around and not being there just because somebody makes us, but because we finally understand why it matters and how we have a much richer, more important opportunity by doing that together. So I really just wanted to thank you for that insight, because I think that's really, really powerful. So I am the Executive Director for Children's Services in Dorset Council. I consider that to be a very privileged position too. And it's a lovely opportunity to debate this today. Personally, I'm entering my 40th year of work in the world of children's services, and today served by providing leadership for our incredible staff working with our families and communities. It wasn't always the story. As a daughter of economic migrants and one of 9 who experienced challenges and burdens beyond those that were sometimes manageable, I sometimes reflect that my own life can best be represented as 3 acts. Act 1, at risk, Act 2, taking risks, and now Act 3, managing risks. And yet that barely tells any of the story, as it does for so few of us. For we all know all of our lives and our lives of our families are richer by far than a one-dimensional aspect of risk alone. Because there are strengths too, and there were for me at every stage, high days and salad days, there but for the grace days, days and moments that shape a life. So no binary equations here. I think what I really wanted to do is to come back to that kind of theme of today's seminar, partnership at families every day at every level. So first consider, I think, when forging any partnership, really important to think about. Sorry, I'm having a bit of a technical thing. I'm hoping you can still hear and see me, but I've lost all of you. So I'm going to keep going. I guess to keep thinking about, you know, we're for forging a partnership. So any good partnership, you kind of think about the component parts, I think, before joining up. So I wondered, how's the family? And for far too many, I think the answer is it's under pressure, under attack, and under-resourced. 30% of children are living in poverty, higher still if you're a lone parent family or Black or Asian minority ethnic family. And 3/4 of these children, as we all know, really having a member of the family working and half of those families with 3 or more children, that poverty having very long-lasting effects, meaning that by GCSE year, there is a 28% gap between children receiving preschool meals and their wealthier peers in terms of the numbers achieving those 5 A to C grades. And that yawning and growing gap of inequality of opportunity and outcome blights childhoods. For many families, not having enough money to cope with the circumstances in which they're living means going cold, going hungry, not being able to join in activities with friends or have holidays, not being able to repair the broken boiler or ever escape inadequate housing. Indeed, being permanently financially precarious. And I was struck by what did that remind me of? So how is the system? The child welfare system is overstretched and overwhelmed. For too many years, the level of funding and investment in our children's lives has diminished in the face of austerity and a fundamental lack of understanding, I believe, that every pound well spent on a child is early intervention in the life of a well-rounded, effective adult. But much of the debate around funding has focused solely upon the diminishing children's services budget. And for sure, the funding stream, one after another, disappearing for many years, the early intervention grant, the Sure Start programme, the play strategy, the distortion now of the care market by private equity bullying its way into big profits has created, as a director of children's services, an almost impossible task of balancing a budget in line with heightened need. But I think the significant underinvestment in children's lives is also often overlooked. If we look at the underinvestment in children's health, community health, but particularly mental health, we know that all of that adds a further layer for those families and the challenges they're facing. The UK has the second highest GDP in the EU, but it sits 17th in the table on spending on education. It also is a similar position on spending on early childhood education and care. So when Josh McAllister, who I'm very pleased to share a place at this conversation with this evening, stated that our children's services system is a 30-year-old Jenga tower held together with sellotape, simultaneously rigid and yet shaky, I didn't wholly disagree. However, I was a little fearful and a little furious that such a statement would add to the demoralisation of the very hard-pressed staff who, in my experience, stand under that tower each day, attempting to prop it up to avoid the greater inevitable disasters that would emerge from its ultimate downfall. For I think such statements seen and heard in the absence of an understanding of the context of the bigger picture of neglect of our country's children and their families adds to the blaming game that has no good outcome for anyone. So it's clear then that the partnership between families, often unprioritised and unheld by society, and the system itself neglected, is a partnership populated by at least two parts who share wobbly foundations and frameworks. The culture of blame, shame, and fear has permeated the system, affecting those working in it and the very children and families reliant upon it. This very mirror of experience, I believe, leads the systems towards doing to families rather than working with them in collaboration. It should be no surprise for any of us working in that system that families feel an increasing mistrust of and often express anger at the system and those delivering it. Why wouldn't they? A system where, without the right leadership, support and training, leads individuals to seek refuge in overly procedural responses, to cover themselves frequently, but not provide suitable cover with families. So our crucial partnership, and it is a crucial partnership, is buckling under the weight of underinvestment, blame, shame, and fear. And we know that what truly gives partnership its wings is the ability to build and sustain open and trusting relationships. Much good, in my opinion, about the 1989 Children Act. But what we're now living with and surrounding us are a wealth of systems, structures, legislation, and regulation that fail to address the fundamental problems faced by both families and the system designed originally to support them. And too much of the debate remains rather binary. Across the country, in every city, town, and village, families need early help to prevent difficulties escalating, simultaneously with some families needing help when matters are severe and troubling. But we hear this debate about, is it early help or is it high-end intervention? Well, many of these families are the same families with dynamic lives and needs. You don't stay in any one space. Your life changes and transfers into a category that having the sense of invest in one or the other is not helpful. It has to be both, and it has to be both simultaneously. Family circumstances are dynamic, individual, and systemic. And any attempt, which I fear is some of the conversations that we're hearing, to create a simplistic response disavows that truth, that such dynamism requires, I believe, an even more fully integrated and highly personalized response. Listening to some recent debates about separating and cutting away from each other parts of the system have led me to be greatly concerned. And I think if we replaced the word system with family, we'd understand the dangers of separating different aspects in what is a complex structure. I don't believe there's a director of children's services in the country that doesn't subscribe to the Family Right Group commitment of wanting children and their families to get the help they need, so wherever possible, children can live safely and flourish within their family network. And yet delivering that for every family and every day in a manner that ensures they are treated fairly and have their rights respected and are able to make informed decisions is still far from a universal truth. On a daily basis, local authorities are living with and struggling with the huge challenges that the care system presents at the present time. I started my career for 7 years. The initial years of my fantastic 40-year journey was in residential care. And I've had leadership of that provision all over those last 4 decades. It's never needed more support. It's never needed more leadership, and it's never needed more investment. But that policy debate for another day. As we all know, that whilst many children in the care do have lasting and long and loving relationships, far too many of them don't. I was really struck by the UCL research published this week, which tracked over 350,000 children between 1971 and 2013, that concluded what I think we've known, but the escalation of the poor quality life outcomes and in the increased likelihood of a premature death, ranging from 40% early in that stage up to 60% in latter years. So as we got closer to everybody else in the population having better life outcomes, our children who had been brought up in care were actually having a massively increased likelihood of premature death. As I've said, not true for all, but we know the implications are huge. So my personal commitment to work continues to ensure to be that wherever possible, those children can safely flourish in their networks is rooted in a personal and a cultural experience. It's rooted in decades of seeing impact, knowing what works and what doesn't work. It's driven by a deep understanding of the complexity and dynamism of risk, and an understanding of the importance of managing budgets on behalf of our communities. There's little point in me having things running out of control if I can't then provide for the very services that our communities need. But more latterly, also informed by a deep sense of understanding of the demoralization of the workforce when they can see only an absence of options for how they can do their work. We're not supporting the very people who we all depend upon to build those relationships if we can't give them a greater range of options for how to be with families. So it is with a pride in the profession of social work, the profession to which I belong, and in my opinion, a requisite optimism. I really believe our children require us to hold close to hope, that I am hopeful for a future in 2022 for the world of families and the child welfare system working together. And if I can bring influence locally, anywhere else, it will be rooted in ensuring that we as leaders hold on to the complexity in order to avoid the simplicity and any simplistic answers, that to respect that dynamism of family lives. Families' lives lived in acts that go from being risk to managing that risk. But we must abide by the principles of successful partnership. And I think all good partnerships must begin with a vision. And I fear we don't have a national vision for our families. We don't have a cultural norm around what do we want as a country for our families. And I think we need that vision, and I think we need it urgently. And we must continue to hold to the light the truth that investment in children is investment in a stronger, resilient country. I have become somewhat tired of feeling that children's lives, not necessarily children's services, but children's lives are sitting in the corner of the debate around the NHS and adult care. Not that it's not an important debate, it is. But I'm afraid I think our debate and discussion around children's lives is just not front and centre enough. So a good, clear, shared purpose, that purpose must be rooted in a balance of power and control as we guide an ever-integrated partnership that works holistically with families at the heart. I would not seek any further fragmentation of the system. In fact, I would seek further integration of the system, of partnership and people. It's what families have forever told me. They want us to work forever closer together. Yes, in that respectful boundary, but around all of their partnerships too. But the leadership of that work around the family needs further dedicated resourcing and further investment of understanding and commitment. So it will mean stepping into the responsibility of ensuring that our partnership with families is supported by staff who have manageable workloads, are well-trained, competent and confident. Partnerships are complex and at times awkward and challenging, and difficult conversations need to be had by people supported on both sides. What I know from my experience in Dorset is that competent and confident workforce is facilitated and motivated by receiving much more effective and powerful feedback from families and children and witnessing the positive impact in children's lives. So we know it's a virtual circle. Working closer in a more effective relationship with families feeds the morale of our staff and creates that much firmer, positive arrangement for us together. I'm blessed to be close every day to witness that. And we have a very clear process here in Dorset to be able to really get very close to being able to see what matters, not just counting beans sometimes. And we often celebrate the essential and at times almost impossible and hugely valuable work that our social workers and families do every day. But we're not getting it right every day with every family, which is why it is with hope and kindness that we will keep on keeping on, venturing forward together, making mistakes, knowing that we'll get it wrong sometimes, but knowing that if we get closer to each other, with our families, we will get it right more often. Thank you.
We're going to hear a little bit more from some of our experts by experience now.
Hello, my name is Janice. We first became involved with Children's Services because we wanted to adopt a child following years of unsuccessful IVF.
Hi, my name is Kate. I became involved with Children's Services following many years of being in an abusive and coercively controlling relationship.
Hello, my name is Katie Jones. I became involved with Children's Services because concerns were raised regarding domestic violence and lifestyle choices I was making.
My name is Lorna. I became involved with Children's Services because my youngest daughter was not able to care for my twin granddaughters.
Following this second adoption and our signing of the adoption order, our experience of the system changed dramatically, and so did our lives from that point onwards. Our second child was a later adoption, and we subsequently found out had special educational needs, learning difficulties and disability. Every time we asked for help, we were pointed towards some variation of a parenting course. We went on many, and we read countless books on therapeutic parenting, although I'm not entirely convinced we did anything very differently beforehand. My experience of Children's Services has been that if you ask for help, there is a one-size-fits-all solution of being offered some kind of a parenting course. If poor parenting is not the issue and you ask again because the problem is still there, the next port of call, for some inexplicable reason, is to put you under some kind of scrutiny.
My experience of Children's Services has been mainly positive. Following many years of negative interactions with social services, I took my own children to child protection. Following this, as a family, we received the right support, and together with my son's social worker, we have built a positive relationship together, which has enabled us as a family to get the right targeted help. I now feel listened to and valued as a parent, which in turn has a positive impact on my children.
My experience of Children's Services was mainly negative because I was not given a voice and felt judged at every turn. I was unable to be honest and therefore could not seek the help I desperately needed.
There were some difficulties, but they were overcome by me getting advice from FRG with certain bits of the law that I was not aware of, and also gaining information from FRG so that when I did attend meetings, I could understand what was being said and what was going on and what was going to happen next.
Training around disability, trauma-informed responses to challenging behaviour, training around mental health, and to properly involve parents in decision making, assuming that they have solutions rather than causing difficulties. We nearly lost everything, and we wouldn't want anyone else to go through what we have.
In my opinion, the most important changes that could be made to the child welfare system so that it works for families would be consistency. Social workers and family workers and other professionals need to remain the same throughout so that relationships can be built with the family. Transparency. Families should be better informed about what is happening along each step of the process. And support, outside confidential support, should be provided for all those affected in the form of either advocacy or peer support from those with lived experience.
is to make it work to keep families together and safe, with the right help as early as possible. When social workers begin working with families, the most important thing they can do is to build a positive relationship with them. Families often mistrust agencies and may have had numerous negative interactions already by the time they come to Children's Services attention. The time taken to forge relationships can ultimately decrease the time a family is within the service, as a positive relationship can mean a family engages quicker and is more open to intervention. When families and Children's Services work well together, the benefits to the family can be life-changing.
I'd like now to introduce our next speaker, Kathy Ashley, the Chief Executive of the Family Rights Group. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Tori, Stuart, Kate, Katie, Janice, Lorna, Martin and Hussein for their contributions to the audio, and also to Teresa for a tremendous speech. And I loved your points, especially the importance of hope and kindness. It is exceptionally inspiring working with family members, practitioners and decision makers who are driven to improve the system for others. And boy, is that determination needed now. At Family Rights Group, we're really proud of the charity's contribution in the Drawing Up of the Children Act 1989. It remains an extraordinary piece of legislation. It received cross-party consensus during Margaret Thatcher's time as Prime Minister. Just think about that. It drew on a robust research and evidence base. It set out lasting principles. The importance of partnership working between families and state in the interests of children underpin the Act. Family Rights Group believes we now have to be part of achieving an equivalent seismic shift in the child welfare system. This time, it isn't primarily about redrawing our legal framework. It's about something even harder. It's about shifting behaviour, culture and practice, and it's a challenge that involves everyone with an interest in the system. As has been alluded to, we have a child welfare system which is in crisis, despite the extraordinary hard work and good intentions of many. One that is not consistently working well for children, their families or practitioners. Those who the system is meant to be there to help, such as young parents who are themselves were in care, or parents who are domestic abuse victims, are often the most harshly judged and treated by it. We have a system which too readily resorts to investigations and assessments at the expense of support. Over the last 11 years, for example, the number of families in England subject to a child protection inquiry that did not result in a child protection plan increased nearly threefold to almost 150,000. In 2017, Family Rights Group facilitated a sector-wide care crisis review. And as Teresa has pointed out, lack of resources, poverty and deprivation are making it harder for families and children's services to cope. Children and families are too often not getting the help they need early enough to prevent difficulties escalating. That culture of blame, shame and fear permeates the system, affecting those working in it as well as children and families reliant on it. And there's an environment which is increasingly one of mistrust and risk adversity, in which practitioners seek refuge in bureaucratic responses. These challenges have been amplified by the pandemic. Many families face increased stresses, financial hardship and isolation. Many services, including domestic abuse support services and perpetrator programs which may have mitigated risks, have closed or reduced provision. During the pandemic, remote or hybrid child protection conferences or court hearings were organisationally expedient at times, but we know from our advice service that some parents were left feeling even more bewildered or effectively voiceless when significant decisions were being made about their child. Many of us, and I'm sure, in fact, all of us in the room, are trying to deal with the crisis by working longer and longer hours and getting burnt out. Meanwhile, Depleting children's services funds are being spent on commissioning hugely expensive, often unsatisfactory placements for small numbers of children, while some companies make excessive profit margins. Just as there's no one reason why we're in this place, so there's no one individual, organisation or policy solution. What I set out here are 6 tests going forward as to whether our child welfare system is good enough. 1, does it assist families to get the help they need? 2, does it help children to live safely within their family? 3, does it build or break children's relationships? 4, does it improve children's well-being over their lifetime? 5, are families treated fairly and able to make informed decisions? And 6, does it work in partnership with families in the interests of children? So how do we secure that good enough child welfare system? Firstly, every part of society has responsibility for our child welfare system, and that includes national government. These are tests against which current and future government policies, legislation, and funding decisions should be measured. If they don't help, or if they don't go far enough, they need to change. It's that simple. Secondly, reform of our system has to learn from those with experience of it, not as a one-off consultation, but as an integral part of how child welfare organisations operate, how children's services, for example, design and run services and construct policies. One of the innovations of family rights groups' family panels, in conjunction with social workers, was the mutual expectations document that's on our website. Take a look at it. It sets out what families should be able to expect of children's services and what it is reasonable for children's services to expect of families. Deceptively simple, it's a radical document. Thirdly, we need to value families, however a child and their family choose to define that, by supporting them to take the lead in making decisions and determining what help they need in the interests of their child. Families should be offered a family group conference wherever they are on the child welfare continuum, and that includes pre-birth. It should be a family's right to have a family group conference before a child enters care, except in emergency situations. Family group conferences increase the opportunities for exploring prospective kinship carers or planning for children to return home from care, as well as keeping them safe there in the first place. And as you think about solutions, bear in mind that family group conferences originated in New Zealand with Maori groups inspiring change as a response to oppressive practice that separated many children from their communities. Fourthly, kinship care needs to be the first thought, not an afterthought, if a child cannot remain at home. After all, it's what we would want to happen to our own families if our child couldn't remain with us. The Parliamentary Task Force on Kinship Care found a third of looked after children in England who were living with kinship foster carers had been first placed in the care of someone they didn't know and were not related to. In many cases, that need not have happened. There's also significant variation in how local authorities explore and support kinship care as an option. Around half of kinship carers have to give up their job to take on the children, and that drives them into financial hardship and poverty. An immediate step the government could take would be to extend adoption leave to kinship carers. In fact, it's an outrage that it isn't extended already. There's probably no greater example of how partnership working isn't sufficiently entrenched in our child welfare system than the call we received to our advice line during the pandemic from a woman whose little brother and sister had moved in following their parents' death from COVID and be told by children's services that they weren't entitled to support because it's a private arrangement. Next week, we're running a seminar that will explore kinship care further, but I know Caroline Lynch, Family Rights Group's Principal Legal Advisor, will be suggesting a common definition of kinship care to be written into policy and legislation that can be a passport to support, regardless of whether the child is under a care order, a special guardianship order, or indeed any order. Fifth, We need a system in which families whose children may be at risk of state intervention are able to make informed decisions throughout. Last year, 18,000 people contacted Family Rights Group's advice service, the highest in our history. Evaluations show it helps families to navigate the child welfare system, face up to concerns, understand their rights and options when dealing with children's services. Yet current funding means we can only advise 40% of callers, and our funding for next year isn't secure. We've also previously run a parental advocacy service for families involved in child protection conferences and know how this too can change the dynamics between families in the state. But again, this requires funding. And the scope of legal aid needs to be extended. It's frankly heartbreaking when talking to kinship carers who've run up debts of thousands of pounds in legal costs on advice and representation because they stepped in to secure the future of a child in their family. The president of the Family Division's Public Law Working Group, which Ms. Justice Knowles referred to, has set out best practice to improve how the system works pre-proceedings. Building upon this, we're delighted to have received funding from the Legal Education Foundation to co-produce and pilot a new approach to pre-proceedings in 2 family justice areas. Through this and a national programme for the judiciary, we'll seek to re-emphasise early and effective partnership working with families and create the conditions for safely averting the need for proceedings. As the Independent Care Review has highlighted, all of us, and children are no exception, need positive relationships to turn to for practical and emotional support. Yet too often the care system breaks relationships when children go into care, including with brothers and sisters, friends, former teachers, and many more. As they become adults and professional support networks fall away, we know the adverse consequences for many young people. Family Rights Group has co-designed the Lifelong Links approach with stakeholders, including local authorities, and I want to pay tribute to the many that we have worked with, and including young people in care. It aims to create a lifelong support network for children and young people. A trained coordinator works with the young person to find family members and all who care about them, and bring them together in a celebrated conference to make a lasting support plan. Impact studies and evaluation shows it's increased the number of connections for a child from 7 to 26, and it's enabled them to be more stable where they're living. It helps shift the culture and practice in the rest of the authority into one of prioritising relationships from the outset, and it should be an offer to all children in care. Alongside addressing the wide shortfall in investment in children's services, there needs to be a new and sizable 5-year funding stream available to all local authorities. It would be awarded on the basis of a local plan developed with local partner agencies, including Family Justice Board, community organisations, and critically, children, young people and families. The fund will be a catalyst for doing things differently to reduce the number of children in care, including the solutions set out here. And as the numbers of children in care reduce, it would allow authorities to develop joint commissioning strategies to provide specialist placements and reduce dependence and expenditure on private sector providers. Ultimately, it's a vital part of our healthy democratic country that we have a child welfare system in which all communities and all stakeholders can have trust and confidence in. Thank you to all of you who are trying so hard to achieve that.
Thank you very much, Kathy. I'd now like to introduce our third and final speaker, Professor Carleen Furman, MBE, who is a Professor of Social Work at Durham University. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me at this event. It's a real honour to be here with you all and to follow such incredible contributions. What I'm going to focus on for the next 12 minutes is to consider how we build partnerships with families who are affected by harm beyond their front door. And why am I focusing on this? Well, in 2018, Working Together to Safeguard Children was updated to make reference to what the government termed extrafamilial harms and threats, noting that as well as threats to the welfare from children, Within their families, children may be vulnerable to abuse or exploitation from outside their families, and that these threats might arise at school and other educational establishments, from within peer groups, or within more widely communities or online spaces. And then they listed a range of harms that these might include, including exploitation by criminal gangs and organised crime groups, trafficking, online abuse, teenage relationship abuse, sexual exploitation, and the influences of extremism leading to radicalisation. This change in statutory guidance followed over a decade of campaigning amongst researchers, voluntary sector organisations and families who have been affected by those harms and received challenging responses from partners, as well as the system itself, particularly the child protection system, who have been charged with responding to risks that weren't necessarily considered when the system was designed. To give you an example, when I was reviewing cases in 2011, a young woman I'll refer to as Sarah, aged 13, stated that if you're rude to them, then they'll beat you up. And I've seen how they beat up people, how everyone's scared of them. I said no for something very little. I've been beaten up and bottled, and I realised if I did say no, what would happen? I was pressurised and scared. I knew deep down I didn't want it because I was still young, but I didn't have a choice. And that was Sarah's account of the sexual exploitation she experienced over an 18-month period, largely in public spaces, including parks, the toilets of fast food restaurants, and in transport hubs, by other young people aged 13 to 15. When interviewed, Sarah's mother stated, "There are things going on in Sarah's world that I don't have access to. She is being controlled by others more powerful than me." In Sarah's case notes, she was referred to as being difficult to engage with, anti-police, and someone who places her friends and gang associates as a higher importance than her family. And so the plan for supporting Sarah and her family was to allocate her a mentor, put her mother on a parenting course to increase boundaries that would be set for her to keep her away from the group of young people that was causing harm to her. And when those interventions didn't work, Sarah was taken into care voluntarily and relocated hundreds of miles away from the family home for her own protection. What we see time and time again when we look at these issues is that the response to them is misaligned to where the risk is sitting. We know that these issues present a risk of significant harm to children and to their welfare. And so child protection systems, wider children's services departments, and the social workers within them have been called upon to respond. But as has been heard in different ways over the course of this evening, we are working in a system that is focused on parenting. And so parents of children like Sarah will be the subject of the assessment alongside Sarah and will be intervened with alongside Sarah. We see a range of interventions that focus on parenting, like boundary setting courses for parents. And when parents are assessed to be protective, despite their children being at risk of significant harm, including a threat to their lives, we've seen cases closed to children's social care with no ongoing support to those families, even when families ask for that support. And in addition, we see risks persisting within young people's friendship groups, schools, and the public spaces where that harm is occurring, despite successful prosecutions related to those harms. And in the initial 9 cases I reviewed, in 7, harm persisted in contexts beyond the family home after successful prosecutions. In light of this challenge, 54 areas around England, Wales, and Scotland are currently working with myself and members of my research team to explore what a contextual safeguarding approach might look like in response to these types of harms, trying to create systems that can achieve 4 things. The first is to target the social conditions that enable this type of abuse to occur, not just see the child in the context of their school or their friendship group or the transport hub where they wait for a bus, but to be able to identify what's happening in those contexts, assess them, and intervene with them in order to create safety around those children. The second thing the system needs to be able to do is to respond to contexts through the lens of child welfare. We've increasingly seen over recent decades a community safety and policing response to contexts beyond the family home. And key to a contextual safeguarding approach is reducing the extent to which we see criminalisation as a route to safety for children affected by extrafamilial harm. Even though police investigations may play one part of the response, there'll be many families supported by children's services who aren't under a police investigation, and that needs to apply to children who come to harm beyond their front doors as well. And yet we see an ongoing challenge with current legislation being pushed through Parliament related to serious violence, which will likely increase the policing of children affected by extrafamilial harm, but not the protections they're afforded. The third part of the system relates to partnerships. Contextual safeguarding approaches require that social workers form partnerships with the people that can make a difference in young people's friendship groups, schools, and public spaces. And that means seeing young people, their parents and carers, and wider families as partners, alongside those who drive buses, man shopping centres, youth workers, schools, and so on. And our recent interviews with young people, time and time again, they spoke about bus drivers and shopkeepers as key sources of protection for them when they would be on the family home. And finally, the system needs to be able to measure its impact on context and not just on children. Not just is Sarah any safer due to the response we've provided, but is the park where she was assaulted any safer? Or have we taken Sarah out of that situation and another child has taken their place? That, in essence, is contextual safeguarding. It's any system response that can target the context in which this type of harm occurs through a lens of child welfare rather than criminalisation, in partnership with the people who can make a difference in those places and spaces, and measuring its impact contextually. So what does working in this way mean for parents and families, and particularly partnership working with parents and families? We've been working to test contextual safeguarding systems now for 3 years. And during that test period, we've identified a range of ways in which parents have been supported as partners in protecting their children, and indeed wider families and carers. And I just want to share 3 examples that have emerged recently through our programme. The first is the development of what some sites are referring to as a risk outside of the home child protection pathway and category. This is where the risk of harm to a child is significant, including a threat to life, and where some of those children historically have been closed to children's social care because parents are doing all they can to keep their children safe. When observing those conferences, we've seen scaling questions used with young people and parents first before professionals have been asked to scale how safe or unsafe this young person is. And importantly, asking all partners in attendance, including young people and parents and carers, to identify where is safe or unsafe for this child, noting often that the home is the safest place for that child to be, and the places where they're most unsafe are out of the reach of their parents and carers. The partnership is then tasked with targeting those unsafe areas as part of the plan to support that child. The second area we've seen partnership working happen with parents is in our work to look at the use of relocations in response to extrafamilial harm. Recently, we surveyed 13 areas to identify how many children they moved a distance from their family home and family community as a result of a range of harms that have occurred outside of family relationships or family homes. And the rate of movements ranged from no children being moved in the month of September 2019 to 25% of all children open to children's services for extrafamilial harm being moved in that month. And speaking to young people, parents and professionals involved in those moves, we developed resources, including resources for parents, highlighting things that they may want to consider before, during and after relocation is considered for their child, linking that advice to further guidance for professionals and young people to consider in order to promote relational safety as key as physical safety for children where a move is being considered. And finally, we're seeing a range of responses to young people and their families affected by extrafamilial harm that go beyond parenting courses, including immediately speaking to parents and carers about what they think the issues are for children at the point of a referral in for support. Establishing parent support groups so that parents can support each other in the difficulties and challenges they may encounter when raising adolescents in general, but also raising adolescents affected by exploitation or other issues. We've seen the development of parent champions, championing protective structures in community settings and amongst residents to protect children in the after-school window. And as part of that, we've seen the broadening of the idea of guardianship and capacity to safeguard, so that everybody isn't solely thinking about a parent or carer's capacity to safeguard their child, but is also thinking about our collective capacity to safeguard children and young people, and where our community guardians may be when children are not in the family home. We've also seen support to parents and carers that raises their awareness of adolescent development and the changes that they may see in their child's behaviour, which can create tension in the relationship, and without support may lead to a breakdown in the family home. When I was preparing for this event and I listened to the contributions from families from the family rights group that were played earlier on in this event, I noticed some key patterns that we see emerge in the testing of contextual safeguarding, and I wanted to highlight those in the close of my contribution. Firstly, what is the system focused on? We heard from a number of family members that their experience was an intrusive and investigative system that focused on the action they'd taken or inaction that was associated to risks that children were facing. In our testing of contextual safeguarding, we're seeing the system's focus shift to look at what the sources of harm are and sources of safety. And often those sources of safety are parents and carers facilitating partnership work. What is the system targeting? When we started working in local areas, we saw the system targeting solely a parent's capacity to protect their child from issues like exploitation. 3 years on, we're seeing those same areas try to develop a collective capacity to safeguard children, and indeed challenging the partnership rather than the parents to act differently in order to safeguard the welfare of children. When we look at decisions to place children in care, we see responses that are focused on securing the physical safety of children, despite knowing that this might undermine the relationships that are protective for them. As we move towards contextual safeguarding systems, we see the foregrounding of relational safety, not just with parents, carers, and wider family members, but also young people's peer relationships and their wider communities. When it comes to partnerships, we have seen historically primary partnerships between social care and policing and health in response to extrafamilial harm, particularly social care and policing. But in the testing of contextual safeguarding, areas are being urged to form partnerships with young people, families, and wider communities to create sustainable safety in places and spaces where harm is occurring. And finally, in terms of how this child protection and wider children's services structures are perceived, when we started work, we were seeing a focus on the shame associated with receiving support from those services and the judgment families felt. What we're seeing now is the role of social workers in providing help and also providing a sense of analysis to complex situations that require often multi-agency safety plans to create safety around children and families. I hope that's been a helpful introduction and contribution to this evening's event. I would note that there are probably many aspects of contextual safeguarding that speak to issues beyond those that I'm concerned with in terms of extrafamilial harm, and also potentially create a risk where we have one system for harm that exists beyond families and one system for harm that's perceived as being within it. And that is a risk that we continue to grapple with in the hope that the strides made in contextual safeguarding will be of benefit to all those involved in children's services and not just those affected by the issues where my research is focused. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Carleen. What we're going to do now is open up the discussion to our guests. We've got a small audience here on Zoom representing a cross-section of practitioners, decision and policy makers, leaders, academics, families, and others with a stake in the system. And we'd really like to hear from you about your thoughts on tonight's big question, partnership working with families, and your reflections, having heard the contributions from our three key speakers. We'd like this to be as open a debate as possible. So comments, ideas, challenges to what you've heard, or questions are welcome. And to make sure that we hear from as many of you as possible, we'd ask that people keep their contributions to about 2 or 3 minutes each. So if you'd like to contribute in that way, please could you indicate with the raised hand function if you've got something to say, and we'll get round to you. To those of you who are watching us on the live stream, we'll be following your comments in the chat box and reflecting on those a little little later on too. And remember, you can contribute on social media using the hashtag families as partners. Perhaps I wonder if we can start our discussion if I ask Brid Featherstone to start and share her observations.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much to Kathy and the Family Rights Group for the invitation to this. It's been both extraordinarily powerful, but also very sad, actually, because some of this stuff is not new at all. We've been talking about some of this stuff for a long time, and I'm not quite sure how we haven't got to where we should be getting to. And I want to raise, in my contribution, I want to raise an issue that really exemplifies some of this, which is around domestic abuse, actually, because it's a massive driver of demand in the child protection system. There has been some change, definitely. There are people trying to do different things around the country, across the UK, in fact, but we are a bit stuck. And as Hassan's talk suggested, his contribution suggested, we're particularly stuck in our understandings of men, of people who harm, of those who harmed. And we have tended to have a very rigid lens on harm, on risk, and a very one-size-fits-all approach to how we respond. That's when we do respond, because Kathy is quite right. Actually, we've hollowed out resources to death. You know, we're really struggling. And I think that one of the things I'd like us to think about in terms of working in partnership is how we develop brave, honest conversations with families and with them. One of the themes about tonight is you cannot build a good child protection system in a bad society, in a society where it's failing all of its families, or not all, but many of its families so badly. You cannot build a good child protection system and isolate it in aspect. And when we come back to domestic abuse, we have to have action at a range of levels to deal with gendered violence. We have to look at poverty, we have to look at men and masculinities, we have to look at relationships, we have to look at trauma, and crucially, we have to look at, we have to talk to families themselves. And that's my final point, really quickly. We have to talk to families themselves about what they want from us, what they understand the risks are. We have just finished a change programme facilitated by the wonderful Research in Practice, and the voice of one of the women at that change programme still resonates with me, where she actually told a group of practitioners that she developed her own safety plan, but the practitioners wouldn't even look at it, and she ended up being more frightened of them than she was of the perpetrator. So we have to go back to the men, the women and the children and help get them to work with us around co-producing in this area. But it does require work beyond individual practice responses. And it's a good example of the kind of action we need to take as a society. So thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Yes. Well, no, thank you, Brid. Thank you. I wonder perhaps if we could hear from Chris Nicholson next. Hi, Chris.
Hi, sorry, I forgot to unmute. So as context, I'm the adoptive parent of a sibling group of 4. I'm kinship carer for the son of my youngest daughter, and 2 of my other grandchildren from my middle daughter are currently in foster care. So I have a perspective, various perspectives on this issue. Firstly, just saying, I think Brid is quite right about domestic abuse is, being much talked about, but there's still a long way to go in ensuring that the parent who is subject to domestic abuse doesn't become the victim, victimize themselves. I think there also needs to be a lot more training around mental health, because my middle daughter, whose children are in foster care, she finds it very difficult to leave the house. If she had a physical disability, I don't think that will be used against her, but she gets told that she's putting her needs above those of her children. which I think shows a lack of understanding of mental health. But in terms of specific, some specific things that need to be done, I mean, I suppose my experience with my grandson, who is in who I care for, with Children's Services was very good. They immediately contacted me. We had a discussion about what could be done, and we put various support in place, and then ultimately he came to live with me. The experience with the different local authority in the case of my two other grandchildren was just massively different. And in terms of, you know, from when they were initially had an interim care order, I said, look, can't we have a meeting to explore how we can deal with this within the family? For 6 weeks, I was stonewalled. Then I, having looked at Family Rights Group website, came across this thing called a family group conference, which I, naturally had never heard of before. So I said, I think that's what we need. That took 6 weeks for them even to acknowledge that they might do that. And the family group conference was held the day before the court hearing. Nevertheless, we drew up a plan which the social workers subsequently said was the best he'd ever seen, the most thorough, but it was never presented to court. So Kathy's suggestion that everyone should have the right to a family group conference, I agree with that. But also, once there's been a family group conference, what the family group plan should be presented to the court and considered by the court as well. And I think the other issue I would raise with children's about the way Children's Services operates is there's so little scope for real challenge of them. And the independent reviewing officer system doesn't work in my experience. And it suggests to me, we've been through various social workers, through managers, raised it with the director of Children's Services, still things haven't really got any better, which indicates to me it's not just a problem with individuals, it's a systemic problem. Sorry, that's all a bit negative, but I do think there are some problems with the system, irrespective of funding and other issues.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Can I ask Kathy to make her contribution to this evening's debate? Kathy Evans.
Hi, yes, gladly. But I've had so much food for thought from all of the talks. Carleen, I'm literally just sitting and absorbing everything that you said. I don't have anything wise to add, but Children England is the membership body for children's charities. We started out as the membership body for charitable children's homes. We're really not, I'm certainly not anymore. I started out in social care practice in children's homes and then in secure care. That still informs my read on whether things are sounding sensible or not, but I'm long since a long way from the kind of practice frontier that many of you are closer to. I've been thinking my way out from the very important proposition that practice is a partnership in the first place. That not only that a practice relationship should be a partnership, I'm going to kind of push it a bit further and say there is no social care practice without the families and children that you practice with. So, we need to kind of really think through how that affects some of the power differentials that then follow through from the system. I was really struck by thinking, we've been doing a child first state inquiry recently, and one of the young people in that said, quote, we are all unique. That's what makes us all the same, the fact that we're all unique. So if that's true, and every practice relationship is a partnership with a completely unique person and their completely unique family circumstances, then why do we have KPIs and service models and commissioning and payment by results and commissioning to batches and specialisms? I when I first learnt how to work in a children's home, I realized that good practice is an art, not a science. So the beauty, I'm really relieved to hear everyone defending and supporting the Children Act. In my mind, it offers principles to bring to that relationship and tools to be deployed with your skills. But what we are in, whichever part of the system you're in, and certainly our members are in a system which has become a marketplace for unique selling points, specialisms, models, randomized control trials to prove your efficiency. This is all science stuff, and it plays into the market. And I've seen comments down the side about, what if we had all the money that's gone offshore? This is really important stuff. But that marketplace that most people are most offended by when it's private equity companies providing care is part of new public management that has infiltrated all of our public services. Social work teams who are having to meet KPIs and prove their worth on data. That depends on us claiming credit as professionals for the work that children and families have done on themselves. And if you couldn't have created, what individual organizations don't deliver outcomes. Outcomes are the emergent property from complex systems, to use the human learning systems frame. But we need to move away as a whole system from markets and managerialism and measurements and models, if we are serious about saying that this unique family, this unique child and their unique circumstances who present tomorrow needing help, then the job of the law and the professionalism is to work out collaboratively what to do in that situation, not to put them through a model or a schema. So, outcomes are important. They're a real thing. Of course, it's important to be concerned about outcomes, but they belong to the person that they describe. They don't belong to the profession, and they don't belong to the system. So it is for, if we can improve outcomes for children and families through the work that we do, that's great, but it is for them to tell us whether we helped, because it's pretty much guaranteed that they put in the lion's share of the work themselves to achieve it. And I'm still not worked through on how far that goes in this care review, what it means for the entire system. But we do have ideas about how to reverse that in terms of the marketplace and the commissioning world that wants anyone who's a professional in this system to take credit for the work that families and children do. So I'll share more there, but that's where I went with it. And thank you everyone for your stimulus.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. Can I invite Andy Elvin to contribute to this evening's debate? Hi, Andy. I think you may need to unmute.
I have done, yeah. I need to unmute twice, it seems. Yeah, I just want to ask a question really of panel and others, and very taken by what Chris said about there's problems with the system that transcend funding, and there are. More funding, or what we think is sufficient funding, isn't going to fix anything within our current structures. We have a system that has been built entirely for the convenience of professionals, not for children and their families. And we have, very well developed silos that don't recognise that we're actually dealing with one cohort of children here. And those children go through different doors depending on their circumstances. Some grow up in foster care, some in kinship care, some are adopted, and some return to their birth parents. But the support they and their families receive is entirely dependent on that legal door, even though they're the same children with the same needs and their families need the same support. Until we build a system where all of those children receive the same kind of support, the same kind of training, the same kind of services to help them deal with the trauma that their children have experienced, we're not going to improve things. And at the moment, you know, kinship carers get more support than they used to now, but it's still nowhere near good enough. Foster carers probably get the best support. Adopters have been after that. The worst served group are birth parents whose children return to them. Often their cases are closed after a few weeks or a couple of months, and yet they're dealing with exactly the same issues that foster carers are dealing with, you know, a few streets away. So until we build a system that allows all of those families to receive the same support and a recognition that the children may need support lifelong, and until the state realises that once they remove children from their birth parents, they're their parent for life. They don't get to stop at 18 or 21 or 25, it's for life. Until we have that cultural mind shift and we get rid of the silos and the hierarchy of care that places adoption top and everything else somewhere beneath that, we're not actually going to move on with the kind of support we need for families. And we're going to see the same miserable statistics of, I think, a third of children leave care to go back to birth parents, and 50% of those arrangements break down. And that's on us. It's not on the families, it's on us.
Okay. Thank you, Andy. I suspect that the panel may want to reflect on the challenge you've set down for everyone, perhaps later on this evening. Could I ask Mary Ryan if Mary would like to contribute to the flow of ideas and observations and challenges?
Thank you, Mrs. Justice Noel. I also thank to FRG for holding this event. It's very, very dear to my heart, working in partnership with families. I was the legal advisor at FRG during the 1980s, doing our amendments to the Children Bill, which then became an act. And I have continued to try through all my work on these issues, improve partnership. Couldn't agree more with Breach. We've been talking about this for a very, very long time. I've agreed with everything I've heard said. I love Teresa's ending comment about the importance of hope and kindness. I think the small points about the importance of family group conferencing and that taking the plans more seriously. I think there are huge issues around making sure that what we deliver to families is related to their individual needs. But I very briefly just wanted to say, I know Mrs. Justice Knowles talked about being the lead judge for FDAC. One of the things I've been very involved in is the Family Drug and Alcohol Court. And I think what you see there is within a court setting, by the time families have got to that stage, a way of working in partnership with families, where not only is that being done through the team who are working with the parents and trying to keep them engaged with local services and with the child social worker, but you see that with the judge as well. And you see a humane and kind approach, which may not end up with the result that the parents want, which is the return of their children, but is something which enables them to understand the concerns of professionals. And I think, again, with all of these things, it's a model, but it's a model within which individual responses are delivered to parents. And it would be wonderful if we could look around, as well as all the other things about all the early support for families. Couldn't agree more that early help is, it's part of the whole picture. It's not different to it. If we could see investment in things that are going to support working in partnership with families. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. Steve Walker, I wonder if I could invite you to take the spotlight, as it were, and contribute to our debate.
Thank you very much. Like everybody else, can I just thank the speakers for what were very engaging presentations. But I think there are a number of common threads that come through, I think, from today. The importance of partnerships and relationships, having a system that recognises that and builds those. I think the importance of family and seeing family as a source of strength and support rather than as a source of weakness and problem. I think it's also about the importance of any solution actually looking at it as a whole system, rather than as Andy was saying, trying to think that if we just focus our energies on one part of the system, everything will change. The point I wanted to make, I think, is that if we were looking at things at a local authority level, the one thing we would be saying right from the very beginning is that, look, improving outcomes for children is everybody's responsibility, and we can't do it on our own within children's services. We need to engage with partners. I think as that sits with local government and local systems, I think it needs to sit nationally, and I'm not sure that it does currently. The majority of children who are referred into children's services are not referred in as a result of significant harm. They are referred in because of parents struggling in adversity, not least because of poverty and other issues. Those factors affecting parenting capacity, it's very difficult to organise sufficient support from partner agencies because of priorities that are given elsewhere within the system, yet to arranging that level of support. So if I've got a drug and alcohol issue, but it is not so bad that I require inpatient treatment, but you wouldn't give me the keys of your car, I'm not going to get treatment, from health services because of thresholds there. So therefore, what you see are initiatives like the Family Drug and Alcohol Court, like PAUSE and other things which are there to support parents, but are primarily funded either through grant or through the contribution of children's services. And the difficulty that we've got is we have insufficient funding to get fully upstream and to engage in the way that we would. So that kind of service, I think, is important, and a joint approach around those issues with the responsibility in all agencies to be contributing to providing support to families where there is that level of need and it is affecting the welfare of children, I think would be really helpful. And I think finally, just to re-emphasize the point of, if we're looking at families as a source of strength, we need to support them to stay strong. And I think kinship care has been under-recognised, underappreciated and underfunded for far too long. Thank you.
Thanks. Claire, I think, can I invite you to take centre stage in the spotlight and to make your contribution to this evening's debate?
Thank you very much. And again, thank you so much to FRG for hosting the seminar and, all the really insightful and reflective presentations that I will probably think about a lot more afterwards as well. For those of you who don't know, PAUSE works with women who have had children removed from their care. And we actually talked to some of the women we work with for their key messages for the care review that's going on at the moment. And things that were really sort of resonated with me was, as some of the experts by experience said earlier, communication, transparency and honesty was some of the really important things that they wanted from the care system. And thinking about families as partners and that partnership approach, it feels like if everyone involved in the system doesn't understand what's happening, then they can't, that sort of power dynamic really plays out. And I think some of this could be about resource, but I think some of it is also just an understanding about how trauma can impact on someone's understanding and communication, and really striving for a system that aims to communicate honestly in plain English with people about what's happening, what their expectations are and what's going to happen next. Because so many of the women that we talk to just don't understand what's happened and why it's happened often, and don't understand the process that they've been to. And I really think that's the responsibility of the system to do that and make sure that at least all partners involved and all families involved have that level of understanding, and that's through good communication and taking the time to communicate really well with families as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. I'm going to pause our discussion now, and I'm going to invite Josh McAllister, who's here with us this evening, for his reflections on what he's heard and an update on what the review is doing. So Josh, over to you, man in the hot seat, if ever there was one.
Thanks, Gwyneth. I've managed to get to, well, I was going to say I managed to get to the end of the day without somebody telling me they don't envy me in doing this task. But as has happened most days, I have had that comment made a couple of times already. It's great to be here, and this is one of the topics which is most present in my mind most days, and is a feature of the review that we've made a priority since the very beginning, for no simpler reason than it's what we hear from families. And when you embark on a review that prioritizes at the beginning listening to lots of people who've got lived experience from every end and corner of a system, you need to really listen to it. And one of the things that I've been struck by is how hard some of the messages are for for the review to try and make sense of, because there's such a breadth of diversity of experience. But then crucially, to play that back into the system in a way that doesn't become completely negative and disempowering to people. So it's been a challenge to hear enough in order to make sense of what some of the experiences are for families, and then to as clearly as we can put those messages back into the system and ask collectively, what do we need to do about them? And I'll keep doing that. It isn't always easy, because there are lots of people in the system who, for very good reasons, see their role as making the current system work as best as it can. But some of the messages we have heard so far are such a challenge to some of the conventional wisdom that they do require all of us to dig deeper and think harder and be a bit braver about how we might do this work in the future. And that's really where the review comes in. So it's great to be here, and sorry, I was only able to join a bit later, so wasn't able to hear everybody, but all of the contributions I've heard so far really match up with what we've heard now from over 2,000 people in conversations, many hundreds of parents and family members who've had interaction with children's social care. And we're now at the point in the review where we've tried to capture those experiences. We've published the Case for Change document, which highlights the themes of problems that we saw earlier in the review. We asked people whether we'd missed or misunderstood anything in that process. And then we've independently to that document published a summary of lived experience messages over the course of the review. We've done that twice, and we'll do it again at the end of the review, so that the messages keep coming through the review process. And we're now at the stage where, as well as doing lots of in-depth research work and speaking to lots of services and particularly local authorities, we're doing 10 deep dives, which are really intensive pieces of work in 10 different towns across the country. We're also open to people sharing their ideas with us directly, and we'll publish all of those at the end. It's called the Call for Ideas. I'd encourage everybody who's on this call to share those with us. And I know a number of people who are on the call here have also published their own ideas. And the review would really encourage people to do that, so we can have some of this dialogue and discussion about such an important topic. A few things which have struck me about this question of partnership with parents and families, which I'll share because I think they add to the discussion that we're having here, is that the first thing we've highlighted as a review is that families want help, but they're not getting it. And they're not getting it at a significant scale. So lots of families come forward for help, raising children, as Steve said, in conditions of adversity, which any of us would find hard. And when they are struggling in those situations, they are searching out for help and support and finding that there's very little on offer, and that sometimes when they do come knocking at the door of children's social care or another service, or they're finding ways to say I need help, often the response they get is one of an assessment, and then following that another assessment, and actually very little help as part of the response. And this comes to a tension which we've raised in the review about the combination of doing work which is both about help and protection together, where families often want help from people that they know, who they've got a relationship with, and where the focus is not on risk assessment and procedure, and where they can be really, really honest about what's going on in their lives and what's worrying them about their own children. And that's clearly quite hard in any system to reconcile with responding to significant harm, which is only a minority in the system. Again, as Steve said, better calibrating help and protection together is a central aim of the review. And I don't know what the answer is to that, but it's an inquiry which I would welcome everybody on this call being part of, because getting that calibration right is something at an England-wide level we're just not doing well enough at the moment. The second point concerns rights and the central issue of family rights and children's rights not being served by the approach we take at the moment. I think sometimes the discussion about whether we have an adversarial system which is too fast to investigate or too focused on assessment can be considered an argument about prioritising parents' interests over children. And I think there's some really important nuance to that, which is that a system where you've got closed patterns of relationships between services in an area and the community that they're serving does not serve safety well if it's your objective. If families are not able to come forward and invite in help and share honestly with services, they won't tell us the sorts of things that might worry us. And it's not starting from a place of trust and respect. And secondly, if we've got a service which is preoccupied in its time, focus, and where its money goes on care, which we do at the moment for understandable reasons, given where we are, it's really hard to refocus the system earlier upstream on skilled work to help families with intensity. And that is an issue of children's rights on both fronts, as well as family rights. And it's really unhelpful to see those two things in conflict, and particularly on this question. A more adversarial system that's quicker to investigate will not serve children's rights. And finally, a thought to relay from somebody who has really inspired me, Nick Crichton, who was the father of the Family Drug and Alcohol Court, who, when he was teaching people to be social workers at Frontline, which is where I used to work, said that dignity should be a priority of the system. And I think, again, for the review, one of our tests is how we rewire dignity and promote dignity for parents, wider family members, and for children in care back into the system at every stage. Because the day-to-day grind and priorities and things that keep services moving can too often overlook the experience for everybody involved in it. And we've seen lots and lots of examples of that, where dignity in the process is an objective in its own right for children's social care. So I'll just finish with that, but great to be here.
Thank you, Josh. I'm just going to go to one other member of our audience before turning to our panel for their reflections. And I wonder if I could invite Peter Hutton to make a contribution to the debate. this evening. Good evening, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. And I agree wholeheartedly what has been said already. Just some context, I'm a counsellor in Wiltshire Unitary Council, and I hold the portfolio for children's safeguarding. So safeguarding is at the heart of what I do. And just a couple of points. I think being a large rural council, you know, we have our own challenges, and I think partnership working is vital. And that extends out to neighbouring authorities, because many of our young people will go to our cities in our neighbouring authorities and come back with all sorts of issues back to their families. So a constant partnership is great, but it's also about developing the relationship. I think far too many meetings I attend, partnership working is at the key of it, but it's actually sometimes just a tick box exercise. We have a partner here, we have a partner there. But what really needs to happen is the relationship you have with that partner and how you can share information, share intelligence. So I absolutely agree on that. Also, I agree with the fact that often as councillors and local authorities, we keep talking about the same problem. I think Josh mentioned this, but we must mention and realise that we're talking about families and young children. We can't keep talking about it. If there is an issue, we must try our best to do and resolve it as quick as possible. And I think we also fall into the trap, and it's in the chat box on a number of occasions tonight, where we look at figures for scrutiny purposes, but actually behind every figure is a family or a young child, and we must always remember that. And I think when we do, certainly I chair our corporate impairment board, and when we see actual cases come along, it brings it home to roost, certainly to councillors, that actually decisions have to be made, and you understand the complex needs of many of our families and our young children. So I would just say, yes, wholeheartedly agree with what we do. We must move on as quick as we can. But like all local authorities, it's not just down to us. It is working with others. We need to work together. And I'm sure if there's a willingness to do it, it will happen. But thank you for inviting me tonight.
Thank you, Peter. I'd like to return to our panel for their reflections on the discussions that they've heard. And I know that Angela's also been closely watching the chat boxes as well. So maybe some thoughts on the themes coming up there. Can I ask Teresa, first of all, for your reflections on the audience's contribution and on what the other speakers have said?
Thank you, and just a fantastic conversation completely this evening, and I think some really helpful discussions around, you know, we all know the adage of, you know, what matters is often not what's counted, and there's something around how are we going to bring humanity, love, dignity, the humane and human nature of the work back into the system, because the reality is, as I was saying, I think in my presentation earlier, not doing so demoralizes the very people that we're asking to go into this very complex and sometimes awkward partnership. So our staff come to us, we know, with all of that humanity on display, and over a period of time, I think we see it getting edged and stripped away. So I'm really, really pleased to hear so much of that conversation today. I think that I would want to keep us really focused on that issue of integration. If we think about any psychological health of individuals and systems, integration rather than separation is where you find yourself with the healthiest vehicles. So I think thinking that through, how do we continue to stay as part of an integrated system as we work with families is absolutely critical, because it's when we cut part of ourselves off. Yeah, the issue of consistency is a huge challenge, isn't it? So thank you to the contributors that talked about the real pain of that when it's not consistent in families' lives. I think, Chris, thank you for those contributions. I think we know that regulation doesn't get us there. It's not quick enough. It's not agile enough. It's all rear view mirror, sadly. And so we need to be thinking much more about I always think that we could learn a lot from the airline industry. God forbid if they had a 5-year inspection cycle, none of us would get on an aeroplane. But that real meaning about how do we kind of track things live time, real time, all the time, to be making sure that there's consistency in that. But I've rarely been on a conversation where I've heard so much clear helpful indicators about people working together around a core purpose. So I think that's been really, really uplifting tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you. Kathy.
So first of all, it has been uplifting because we are all critical to what happens next. And I think that's part of the reason why Family Rights Group wanted to have this conversation, to host this conversation, because just like with the Care Crisis Review, where we heard some directed children's services blame judges for decisions in areas, some judges blaming directed children's services, families blaming, there is something about how you collaborate in relation to a solution. And that's what we are attempting to do, recognising both in terms of how we can agree an analysis of the problems in the system at the moment, and then trying to, as with the Children Act, get unity in relation to the way forward. I would say, Andy, money does matter, not because it's the entirety of the solution. We saw when we were doing the Care Crisis Review how the numbers of children in care had increased steadily since 1994, and that is a range of factors, including responses, fear of blame, etc. But there was a slight reduction during the mid-noughties when it felt like Sure Start anti-poverty measures were having an impact. But actually, because what I'm hearing is that children's services managers, directors are spending a huge amount of time consumed in decisions about and making very short-termist and having to make very short-termist decisions in relation to problems which actually require long-term, thoughtful, considered investment. And in that sense, it matters. And that's why it was drawing on, I know Mark in the text, but about the benefits of Quality Protect. It was drawing on the sort of Quality Protect model that I was putting forward, the idea that alongside addressing the underinvestment in our children's services was a fund specifically to act as a catalyst to allow children's services to do that reconfiguring, so that we're just not consumed. I mean, I know, you know, as voluntary organisations, we just, it has got worse. It's become not even just 1 year funding, it's become in-year funding that you're sort of consumed by, and you can't plan and you can't sort of organise in a way that actually works to best advantage. One of the things that I'm really pleased that was raised, Vanya, was about the point about reunification. I think it's a grossly under-focused area of our children's care system in terms of how do we address and support children returning to their families. And it's one of the reasons that the increasing numbers of children in care is they're staying in care for longer, and we're not doing enough around how to support. Lastly, I just wanted to, just in case there wasn't time, I just wanted to thank my colleagues at Family Rights Group who put huge amounts of effort into organising today's conversation, and just really hope that it will spark further thoughts.
Thanks, Kathy. Carleen.
Thank you so much. It's been a real privilege to be part of this event this evening, and to hear the contributions from everybody and read them in the chat box, as well as hear them discussed. I think some of the things that have stood out to me, and the things I've pondered before but continue to ponder now, is, you know, really going back to the purpose or purposes of the systems in which we work. And definitely the thing that I struggle with most with my research is the system and how it responds to the children that I'd be looking at. Is it designed to intervene with parenting, or is it designed to intervene to promote the welfare of children? You know, I think Josh's comment around we want to move away from an adversarial system, kind of investigative system, I think that's right, but it's also a question of what it is you're investigating. And actually in cases that we kind of research and study, what's being investigated is the actions of parents and not the safety of children, and they're not the same thing all the time. So I think even when we are seeing a need for assessment, we have to ask ourselves, what is it we're assessing and what is it we're trying to achieve? And aligned to that is a system that really is built around risk rather than safety, and that being embedded in structures, systems, but then in practices and cultures, really undermining, as kind of Teresa really eloquently described, the kind of internal drive of social workers to be able to do what they want to do and feel like they should be doing, and just feeling, you know, the weight and pressure of that type of system focus. You know, I'm always struck when I read assessments when parents are clearly talking about, we have housing is massively overcrowded, my son won't come home because there's nowhere for him to be, he's out on the street, and the assessment is literally focused on, are you setting boundaries, are you not setting boundaries? That is not because those practitioners don't care about those children. We'll interview those practitioners and they clearly do, but why they won't discuss the housing issue then? Let's talk about the housing issue. Let's think about why that matters to you. You're raising that. Working in a system that kind of, I think Bridget and others have talked about poverty and other issues being a wallpaper to the practice, and we just kind of get on with it rather than being the focus of our practice. So how we rebuild in an ability to state the obvious in our assessments and plans, rather than accept the obvious and try to then get parents to parent in an obviously really difficult situation. So I think we really have to think about what we're assessing, whether we're trying to create safety or just dismantle risk. And just to tag on to the reunification point, obviously in the area that I'm working in, again, what we're seeing is young people with a desire to be reunified with their communities as well as their families, and young people returning to those home communities, whether they're living in their families or not, in very unsafe public spaces because nothing has been done to attend to those spaces while they've been moved. And again, we hear social workers describing breathing a sigh of relief when they move those children hundreds of miles away because they're not up at night worrying about their safety. But then what the partnership response, and it absolutely would be a partnership response, would be to create safety to allow that child to return should they wish to do so, is hugely lacking. And that is not the responsibility of social workers, that's the responsibility of a partnership. So building on community assets, creating safety in communities to allow children to be reunified with their communities, friends and families is something I think we really need to do more thinking on as part of our work going forward.
Thank you very much, Colleen. I wonder, Angela, if you could feed back very briefly to the meeting on some of the themes emerging from the chat bar, because you've been monitoring both of them, as it were.
Yeah, I shall do my best. And as I say, huge shout out to Pam and Sean from FRG who've been helping me monitor the chat. This has definitely not been a sole mission. Really, it's reiterating a lot of what we've heard everybody say today. You know, it's about the importance of mental health support came through strongly. How can we make partnership feel less one-sided and really address the power imbalance that are facing families, and the real need to acknowledge that right from the beginning. Problems with communication, whether it's around outcomes, not feeling part of the process, and how communication is key, and you know, a use of clear language, not confusing jargon, so that families really feel a part of the process. I think sometimes they're feeling set up to fail if they're being presented with a system that they just don't understand. I know Kathy mentioned the mutual expectations charter earlier on, and that is something that I think really moves towards addressing that. The importance to remember accommodation under Section 20 was designed to be part of support services. I think that's something that's important for us to remember. Poverty and deprivation to be seen as an inequality and not used as a reason to blame families for perceived failings. I think Josh hit on that, you know, that we're expecting families to cope in situations that none of us could actually cope in ourselves. Real serious concerns over how care leavers are being treated when they go on to become parents themselves, how they're often faced with having their child removed and not having a parenting role model used as a reason for that, when obviously we had a corporate parent. And somebody else hit on the fact that, you know, that care and that parenting should be for life, not something that ends at 18 or 25 and this cliff edge where they fall off. victims of domestic violence frightened to seek help as they're worried about risking their child, and really how we need to be making sure that victims feel empowered to ask for that help, not so scared as to who they're most frightened of, the perpetrator or the local authority. That the assessment process for kinship care needs to be much fairer. The process is being seen as invasive, expensive, that there's a real lack of support or awareness of the real issues facing kinship families, and that's ongoing. That's not just something that happens at the very beginning, but these families need support throughout. Access to family group conferencing, and how, if the local authority is gatekeeping that, how families can feel it's very difficult to access, and as Kathy said earlier, that families should be able to access FGCs regardless of the point that they are within the local authority. The importance of accountability, scrutiny of decision making, transparency within the court process, accuracy of record keeping. These are all things that we hear at FRG constantly in our panels. So it's great to see that they're coming through across the board. Worrying practice around separating siblings, not just in foster care, but I often hear about it happening with an adoption. And it's about, really respecting their right to that relationship, and how separation must be only as a last resort. And again, the theme around adoption, and how this closed adoption and severing all ties with a child's natural family should again be seen as a last resort, when every other option has been discussed and really scrutinized, not just at, oh well, we've checked and this child has no other options. Lifelong Links has shown that quite often local authorities say that there's no other option for the family, and then Lifelong Links steps in and there's a lot of people there who are able to support that family. As I say, I've touched on the transparency and the issue around the huge variability in services provided and intervention thresholds within individual local authorities, and how we address that while still maintaining that, ensuring that local authorities can provide tailored individual services to families. And I don't think there's really a quick fix for that. And that is a very whistle-stop tour of the things that have been coming through in the chat so far, because I know we're really pushed for time.
Yeah, I think the idea was that I'd provide some closing reflections on the event. You'll have spotted I got Angela to do that for me. But I just wanted to, can I just say a couple of things that occurred to me? For me, one of the key voices that I heard this evening was Katie from one of the family rights panels, saying what she wanted was consistency, transparency, and harnessing peer support, harnessing family strengths. And the other key message for me was a recognition that investment in children is an investment in our future. I think all of us present this evening want to do the best. And I think having debates like this, honest debates about our difficulties, but also thinking about what we can do in the future, is a really, really important part of our processes as individual professionals across the fields that we all represent. And finally, from my perspective, a big shout out to Kathy's cry for action. So big tick there from me. I'll hand over to Angela for about 1 minute of saying goodbye to everyone, but thank you.
Thank you very much, and I promise I will be exceptionally quick, because I think most people's comments have covered it. But I'd just like to end with this, which is partnership working is not doing to families, it's working with them. It's about asking them what they need, explaining their concerns, and finding a way together to set goals and agree really achievable outcomes. And also, we know that even families who don't agree with the final outcome are able to accept it if they felt heard and involved throughout the process. And then when we're talking about working with people with lived experience outside of that process, even those of us who've had the most negative and traumatizing of experiences can have positive ways to feed back into practice. Allowing us to share our experiences to help shape practice for others can be transformative for all. We just need to be seen and heard. And that's all from me. And what I would like to do is remind you all to register for our next seminar, which will be around kinship care and is being held on behalf of the Kinship Care Alliance. And that is Wednesday, the 24th of November from 9:30 till 11:30. And I really do hope to see some of you all there again. Thank you to everybody, and a huge thanks to everybody behind the scenes, including Jordine, Jordan and Lucy, for all their support, because we could not do this without them. Thank you, everyone, and a very good evening.